Yes, let's talk about hockey, the show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. In the modern-day NHL, there are 11 total teams west of St. Louis, Missouri, which is located right next to the Mississippi River. However, before 1967, the NHL never had a single team located any further west than St. Louis. But that does not mean that professional hockey didn't reach the western half of the continent until the 60s. Far from it, in fact. You see, during the days of the NHL's predecessor, the NHA, and up through the NHL's first decade as a league, the Eastern professional hockey clubs were consistently challenged by the major pro league of the West Coast, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association.
After their family's lumber business brought Frank and Lester Patrick out west to Nelson, British Columbia in 1910, the two former stars of the NHA's Renfrew Creamery Kings decided to risk their family's fortune by starting up their own professional hockey league in 1911. This required building new rinks in Vancouver and Victoria, and since the climate in the areas prevented natural ice from forming, the rinks were required to feature the new artificial ice innovation. While the arenas were being built, 3 clubs were formed to participate in the new league: the New Westminster Royals, the Victoria Senators, and the Vancouver Millionaires. But aside from the rinks, the new clubs also needed players. So the Patricks began a raid of the NHA's rosters, plucking up 23 players from the Eastern League to stock their own, including Canadian star Newsy Lalonde. With everything now set, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association was formally organized on December 7, 1911, to be run by the two Patricks, who would also play and manage the Vancouver and Victoria teams. The first game of the PCHA was played on January 3, 1912, between the New Westminster Royals and the Victoria Senators, with the Royals dominating the Senators by a score of 8-3. This would begin a season-long trend for the Royals, as they went on to win 8 more games in their 16-game schedule, winning the first PCHA league title in the process.
Though the PCHA would not challenge for the Cup during its rookie season, and their raids on the NHA's roster set tensions between the two leagues high, in March of 1912, a West Coast tour of an NHA All-Star team was arranged and billed as a sort of World Series of hockey. The result of this series, though, would be the NHA not only losing the first 2 games by scores of 10-4 and 5-1, but also ultimately losing one of their biggest stars, when Cyclone Taylor officially joined up with the PCHA's Vancouver Millionaires a few months after playing on the NHA's All-Star team.
During its second year, the PCHA continued its roster raiding ways, and though the league would lose Newsy Lalonde back to the NHA, it would gain players like Goldie Progers, Eddie Oatman, and Jack McDonald. By the end of the year, the Victoria Senators' 10 wins gave them the PCHA crown, but once again there would be no official challenge for the Cup. Instead, Victoria had to settle for a mere exhibition series against the Stanley Cup champion Quebec Bulldogs, which they won 2-1. For the 1913-1914 season, the PCHA and NHA finally started to come to terms with one another, making agreements to recognize each other's player suspensions and contracts, and instituting a controlled draft process to facilitate the transfer of players between leagues. Additionally, they agreed that the champions of each league would face each other for the Stanley Cup at the end of each season. However, a controversy occurred with the first attempt at this new format after the 1914 season ended, when a miscommunication between the PCHA, NHA, and Stanley Cup trustees resulted in the failure to file a formal challenge for the Cup. As a result, the Stanley Cup Series between the PCHA champion Victoria Aristocrats and the NHA champion Toronto Blueshirts never received the official sanction from the Stanley Cup trustees, but was played nonetheless, with Toronto winning both games to claim the Cup. After this unofficial Cup Series, the trustees came to an agreement with the NHA and PCHA, ironing out the terms that ended the challenge era of Stanley Cup competition and instituted the new World Series system.
To start out the 1914-1915 season, The PCHA schedule was lengthened to 18 games. The new Westminster Royals Club relocated to Portland, Oregon and was renamed the Rosebuds, making the PCHA the first Canadian league to expand to the US. And finally, the PCHA established the first ever hockey farm system in the British Columbia towns of Grand Forks, Greenwood, and Phoenix, known as the Boundary Hockey League. By season's end, the Vancouver Millionaires finished at the top of the league to end a victorious streak of PCHA championships and set themselves up to play against the NHA's Ottawa Senators for the Stanley Cup.
All the games for this championship series were played at Vancouver's Denman Arena, with rules alternating from game to game between the PCHAs and the NHAs. Thanks in large part to former Ottawa star Cyclone Taylor's team leading 6 goals, Vancouver ended up scoring 26 total goals while limiting the Senators to just 8 overall, to give them victories of 6-2, 8-3, and 12-3, a sweep in the series, and the first ever Stanley Cup win for a Western team. Despite the success for this new Cup Finals series, relations between the PCHA and NHA turned sour again in 1915, with the Patricks accusing the league of reneging on their agreements concerning the interleague draft process. In retaliation, the PCHA again went on a raid, this time snatching the core of the Toronto Blue Shirts Club to stock the newest addition to their league, the Seattle Metropolitans. In the now 4-team league, the Portland Rosebuds would be the dominant team during the 1915-1916 season, becoming the first American-based club to play for the Stanley Cup when their PCHA crown this year set them up against the Montreal Canadiens. This best-of-5 series was played at the Montreal Arena, and thanks to the goaltending of Georges Vezina and a tie-breaking goal by George Proger in Game 5, the Canadiens won the Cup back for the Eastern League. For the 1916-1917 season, the PCHA became predominantly American in its franchise locations, when the Canadian government's takeover of Victoria's Patrick Arena for wartime training purposes forced the Victoria Aristocrats to move to Spokane, Washington, where they renamed themselves the Canaries. With 3/4 of its teams now located in the U.S., it wasn't hard for an American team to once again get a shot at the Cup. This time, the Seattle Metropolitans emerged from the newly expanded 24-game schedule as the PCHA's champion club, setting them up to play the defending Cup champs from Montreal. Though Montreal would dominate Game 1 with an 8-4 score, they would be held to 1 goal in each of the next 3 games by Seattle's Harry Holmes, allowing for Bernie Morris's 14 goals to crush the Canadiens' hopes of a repeat and make Seattle the first American-based team to bring home the Cup. While Seattle was riding high, things were not as prosperous in Spokane, where poor attendance ended up forcing the Canaries club to fold, shrinking the PCHA back down to 3 teams for the 1917-1918 season.
However, this season the PCHA would introduce a concept that had only been previously used in the event of a tie: playoffs for the league championship. Now, instead of the team with the best record over the season being declared the champion and challenging for the Stanley Cup, it would be the winner in the postseason who would get that honor. The first postseason matchup would be a 2-game total goal series between the Vancouver Millionaires and the Seattle Metropolitans, with Vancouver's lone goal in Game 2 giving them the series win after Game 1 ended in a 2-2 tie.
With the NHA having been replaced by the NHL at the start of the season, Vancouver headed off to play the NHL's Toronto Arenas Club for the Cup. In this final series, the winners alternated back and forth based on the league rules that each game was played under, with Toronto taking games 1, 3, and 5 under NHL rules and bringing the Cup back east. With dwindling interest in the Portland club, the Rosebuds franchise was suspended for the 1919 season. However, the end of World War I meant that Victoria's Patrick Arena was again available for ice hockey use. So the Victoria Aristocrats Club was reactivated and took over the contracts of all the Rosebud players, keeping the PCHA at 3 teams. Victoria's reemergence didn't change much in the standings though, as Vancouver and Seattle continued their rivalry into the playoffs once again. In a reversal of the previous year's playoffs, the second-place Metropolitans defeated the first-place Millionaires 7-5 over the two-game series, earning a chance to win their club's second Stanley Cup. However, it was not to be for them, but nor was it for their NHL opponents, the Montreal Canadiens, as the decisive game in the series was cancelled before it could be played when players from the Canadiens became infected with the Spanish flu virus. After Seattle's refusal to accept the cup through forfeit, the leagues decided to leave the series as undecided for the first time ever. Over the next 3 seasons, the PCHA would be the battleground between Seattle and Vancouver, with the Metropolitans beating the Millionaires in the playoffs for the league title in 1920, and then Vancouver returning the favor twofold in 1921 and 22, though neither of them would recapture the Stanley Cup for the West. However, around that same time, the PCHA received its first real competitor for professional hockey in the West, in the form of the Western Canada Hockey League.